Start the day informed, entertained, inspired. It's Early Edition with Kate Hawkesby, Newstalk ZB.
Good morning. Welcome on into Early Edition. This morning, we'll get to the UK where nerves are high regarding a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we'll speak with an international analyst here on how such an invasion might affect us.
Bringing you New Zealand's news before the day begins. Early Edition with Kate Hawkesby, Newstalk ZB.
It is 5:14, so the ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine seem to be getting more serious. The US is warning the threat of Russian military actions now imminent and only, in fact, days away. New Zealand's one of a number of countries asking its citizens to leave Ukraine. So is it as dire as what some countries are making it out to be? And more importantly, where do we fit in all of this? International analyst at the Democracy Project, Jeffrey Miller, is with us. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Kate.
Is this as serious as it's made out to be? Can you see this war breaking out or in a matter of days? And by war, I mean, are we looking at more a Russian invasion or an all-out war?
Well, yes, it is. It is pretty serious, Kate. I mean, if the warnings that the US are putting out are anything to go by, you don't tell your citizens to leave the country within 24 to 48 hours if you're not really convinced that there's something to it. It is a really serious situation that we're facing. There's a large number of Russian troops there on the border with Ukraine, and it seems that all the de-escalation efforts over the last several weeks have really come to nothing. So, I think we should take this seriously. I think we should always take individual reports, intelligence reports that the US has been releasing with a grain of salt, bearing in mind what happened in Iraq 20 years ago.
Exactly.
But nevertheless, it is a really serious situation, and we should absolutely be making every effort to avoid war at this point because it is quite scary what's going on.
What's the knock-on effect for us? I mean, obviously we're going to have oil, for example, prices are going to go through the roof.
Yeah, and they already have gone up. I mean, if you filled your car up lately, the cost of oil has gone up considerably because of these geopolitical tensions. War is never good when it comes to oil price if you're a consumer, and we see that effect every day at the pump here in New Zealand. But I think beyond that, New Zealand is a small global trading nation. We rely on selling our goods overseas, and war is going to always disrupt that. If you get a war in Europe suddenly, that's not good for New Zealand exporters. So we are an island literally, but not figuratively. And despite this COVID situation, we are interconnected with the world, and we're going to see the side effects of a war if that happens. So New Zealand's got every reason to try and to speak out against the war and to try and do everything to stop it happening. There is still time to stop a war from happening, but there seems to be less and less time.
Yeah, I mean, not that Putin cares. I mean, what outside of sanctions can NATO or the US do? Because he doesn't even seem to care about sanctions.
No, well, there's not a lot. I mean, the US is really unwilling to commit ground troops to Ukraine. Biden has really all but ruled that out. He's got a small number of troops on standby to send to the region, but we're talking in the order of about 8,000 troops. So it's not really enough to discourage Putin. It seems there's a huge, enormous package of sanctions that's being threatened against Russia, cutting Russia effectively off the banking system and really targeting Russia's oil and gas sector. And, that's 2/3 of Russia's exports, half of its budget that comes from the energy sector, but it doesn't seem to be really deterring Putin. And Putin's really struck up quite a friendship and alliance with China, and especially since 2014 when the last time that Russia went into Ukraine. And that seems to be being a bit of a backdoor at the moment for Putin. If he's going to be pummeled by the West, he'll just go eastwards. So it doesn't really seem that sanctions are deterring him at the moment, but there is still time to avoid war.
Well, I love your optimism, Jeffrey. Thank you very much for being with us. Jeffrey Miller, who is an international analyst at the Democracy Project. It's funny, I was going to ask about the role of China and all this, whether they're just a wee bit too quiet on it all. And regarding a timeline, they're saying by Wednesday Russia will be invading. And you've got to ask yourself, if they get away with it, who else is on Putin's list? What's next? If America and NATO can literally do nothing about it and he gets away with it.
The Jaguar F-Pace SVR. This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Niva Reddy Manu. An international analyst says concerns Russia will invade Ukraine should be taken seriously. The New Zealand government has told New Zealanders in the area to leave immediately. Democracy Project international analyst Jeffrey Miller told Kate Hawkesby it's a serious situation.
There's a large number of Russian troops there on the border with Ukraine, and it seems that all the de-escalation efforts over the last several weeks have really come to nothing.
And German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is the latest to attempt a diplomatic solution. He's heading to Kiev to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and then on to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin. And that's Newstalk ZB News with Hitachi Heat Pumps.
With Bailey's Real Estate, this is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning. It's 6:30. I'm Neva Retimanu. An international analyst says New Zealand would be impacted by a war in Europe. Democracy Project international analyst Jeffrey Miller told Kate Hawkesby if Russia invades Ukraine, it would affect oil prices and New Zealand's trade.
If you've got a war in Europe suddenly, that's not good for New Zealand exporters. We are an island literally, but not figuratively.
That's Newstalk ZB News with Hitachi Heat Pumps, your affordable premium heat pumps.
Right, joining me now is Jeffrey Miller. He's from the Democracy Project at Victoria University in Wellington. Good evening, Jeffrey.
Good evening, Lloyd.
Now, you must, you've sort of been commentating on this for a while here. Can you, I guess, tell me where you stand on all of this? What do you know about what's going on?
Well, it's a day of infamy today, Lloyd, really. 24th of February really will go down as one of those days. And, these are countries that I know to some degree. I spent 3 months in Belarus back in 2018 learning Russian, and Belarusian and Russian troops have invaded from the north, from Belarus into Ukraine, for example. I've been to Ukraine, I've been to Russia, and, it is, as David Parker said, these countries are all very close together, and they all border each other, and it is incredible to see what's happened today. There has been an unprovoked attack, and New Zealand has been very swift with this condemnation, as you would expect, and it's unequivocal condemnation of what has happened. I think you would only expect New Zealand to issue a statement. I think the real question now is whether New Zealand will rush through the introduction of an autonomous sanctions regime. New Zealand just simply doesn't have the legal mechanism to impose sanctions, and that's very different to our Western partners and allies. Australia's got quite a tough sanctions regime now. In fact, they strengthened it last year, and they will be following suit, be following what the EU, what the UK, what the US, other countries are doing. And New Zealand can't actually do that. It can only bring in these lower level measures, which aren't technically sanctions, the travel bans, the measures on exports, diplomatic repercussions. New Zealand could withdraw its ambassador. I think that's quite likely that New Zealand will recall its ambassador from Moscow for consultations, for example. New Zealand called in the ambassador, the Russian ambassador to New Zealand yesterday into MFAT's offices. That was after Russia had moved in a much smaller incursion, what we've seen today. Earlier in the week, they moved into that Donbass region in the east of Ukraine under the guise of peacekeeping. So, there's a lot to consider, and you can hear David Parker, sort of thinking through the options. Obviously, Nanaia Mahuta will have to face a lot of questions overnight tonight and about this when she's in London at the moment, which is convenient, for consultations with all the partners. It's a coincidence that she's over there for a Europe trip, and that will be very much the focus of her. It has been the focus of her trip all week, and will continue to be so.
Yeah, what did you make of what David Parker said there? Because there's actually not too much we can do. Yes, the sanctions and stuff, and there might be retaliatory sanctions. Our two-way trade with Russia is about $500 million. But I guess we want to be on the right side of history.
Yeah, and there will be a lot of pressure on New Zealand to, I think, sign up to the Western position, given just how flagrant this attack has been by Russia on Ukraine. I mean, it's been absolutely at the top level, the upper level of what we could have expected, and it's been exactly what Joe Biden said would happen. But I think a lot of us thought, but perhaps it won't be that bad. Perhaps that's the worst case scenario. Well, it is the worst case scenario that the airport in Kiev is being bombed, and you've got Russian operations throughout Ukraine. So there will be a lot of pressure on New Zealand to sign up to introduce a sanctions regime, rush that through Parliament. I mean, Labour's got the numbers; they can do this if they want to very quickly. There will be a lot of pressure on New Zealand to do this as soon as possible. I kind of think, yes, that would be only to be expected and would be very symbolic. It would be a measure of solidarity, and there's absolute merit in that. I mean, New Zealand is a small country, a small democracy. We value countries playing by the rules and not invading other smaller states. So, we absolutely have an interest in upholding international law. On the other hand, whatever New Zealand does in terms of sanctions is not really going to make much difference in practical terms to Russia. That whether New Zealand impose sanctions or not isn't going to hurt Russia in the way that sanctions imposed by the likes of the UK and the EU and the US will. I mean, those sanctions will cause real financial pain to Russia. And that might not change Vladimir Putin's decision-making immediately, but it might in the medium term and to longer term when, the Russian economy is really hit by this. So, New Zealand's in a different position, just the nature of our size and what we sell to Russia. They don't really need us. But that's always going to be the case with New Zealand. I think there is merit in New Zealand trying to work on the diplomatic track. Diplomacy is not dead, even though this invasion is it's just so awful. Diplomacy is not dead. We're going to need diplomacy more than ever. There's going to be attempts now to try and get a ceasefire. That will be the next step. And I think New Zealand could have a role to play behind the scenes, perhaps in concert with some of these other European countries. And the fact that New Zealand is so far away, is not a member of NATO, and indeed has not imposed or cannot impose sanctions immediately on Russia, might be in New Zealand's favour. From the Russian perspective, perhaps they could see New Zealand as someone that they would be willing to talk to. Nanaia Mahuta asked Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, for a meeting last week, and she said on Tuesday that she hadn't heard back. Well, if she does hear back from Sergei Lavrov, I think she should be pressuring him and offering New Zealand up as a potential go-between. It's a long shot, and I think probably today is not the time for that, with Russia's launching this, unprovoked aggression on Ukraine. But there will be time for diplomacy. We will need diplomacy more than ever. And, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, cancelled his meeting with Sergei Lavrov that was scheduled for today. There's no communication now between the two sides. It's broken down. New Zealand might have a role to play in re-establishing that contact in the future.
Hey, we've got to leave it there, Jeffrey. I do appreciate your time. That is Jeffrey Miller from the Democracy Project. We'll be back after this.
New Zealand has sent messages of solidarity to Ukraine and condemned Russia's actions. But is there anything more concrete that we can do? Jeffrey Miller is an international analyst at the Democracy Project at Victoria University in Wellington. He wrote today that until the recent crisis, neither Ukraine nor Russia were high priorities on New Zealand's foreign policy agenda. And he's with us now. Kia ora, Jeffrey.
Good evening, Karen.
Do you see that position changing much in the coming days and weeks, our priorities?
Oh, yes. I mean, this attack today changes everything, doesn't it? It's a day of infamy. Today, the 24th of February, will go down as a day like 9/11, like the 1st of September in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, like December the 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the US into World War II. So it will be one of those landmark days. And I think we'll see New Zealand fall into line with its Western partners. You've seen that with the statements today, very closely coordinated with other Western countries, and it's only to be expected that New Zealand will issue an unequivocal condemnation of Russia's unprovoked attack of Ukraine today. New Zealand doesn't have an autonomous sanctions regime at the moment, though, so it can't follow suit legally in what its Western partners are doing, like Australia, like the UK, the US, the EU. But I expect that New Zealand will introduce an autonomous sanctions regime very quickly. I think that will be introduced to Parliament very quickly and passed probably under urgency in the coming weeks. And Christopher Luxon, the National leader, has called for that. I don't think the government will put up much of a fight on that.
Can you explain what autonomous sanctions are?
Yeah, we hear a lot about the threat of sanctions being used. You heard that in the interview that you just had there with the Ukrainian journalist, and this is to punish Russia. Short of sending troops, it's the best thing you can do is to impose sanctions, and in particular, these would be targeted on Russian banks, but mainly on the Russian energy sector. Russia earns 2/3 of its export income from the sale of oil and gas. So by hitting that sector, by hitting the activities of Russian oil and gas companies, you're going to punish Russia in a lot of ways. Now, New Zealand can't impose these sanctions. You could well ask, what relationship does New Zealand actually have with Russia? And it's true that if New Zealand imposed sanctions on Russia, as I expect will happen eventually in the coming weeks once that legislation has been passed, that it will be more about symbolism than anything in solidarity. There is value in that, though, because New Zealand is a small state that relies on multilateralism. We don't want other countries just walking in and invading their neighbours. It's about upholding international law. Having said that, I think it's important, for New Zealand as a small state to also go do more. New Zealand is not a member of NATO, is geographically very removed from the situation, and that offers opportunities in terms of the diplomatic track here and in negotiations behind the scenes. The effort now, the war has already begun, so we can't stop the war anymore, but what we can do is now try and get a ceasefire, and that will be the first goal. Nanaia Mahuta, the foreign minister, asked Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, for a meeting last week. She told an interview on Tuesday that she hadn't heard back from him. But if she does, I think she should be offering up New Zealand to play any kind of role in de-escalation, because the direct contact between the West, between the US in particular, and Russia has broken down. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, cancelled his meeting that was scheduled for today with Sergei Lavrov, understandably, but that was cancelled before this attack began. So there is no communication really going on between the two sides now. It's a very dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, like you're saying, Russia has ignored all the weeks of diplomacy and still is these one-on-one meetings. President Biden couldn't rein Putin in. It seems that nobody can. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, and it's absolutely true that, Putin has thumbed his nose at all attempts to bring him to the table. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, tried to broker a summit between Biden and Putin. We thought that it had been agreed to at the start of this week, but within a day of that, Putin was going in to Ukraine already in that eastern region with so-called peacekeeping troops. But things will develop in the coming weeks. We're going to see Russian military operations continue in the coming days. At some point, it becomes a point where Russia perhaps thinks it's achieved enough. And that's when the diplomatic talks really will begin, and Russia will think that it's got some leverage then, and, there will be calls for ceasefire negotiations. So, diplomacy is far from dead, and we've got to keep trying. We can't stop this war from happening, but we can stop a very, very bad situation from becoming even worse and even more dire.
Jeffrey, I believe you've lived in Germany for some time. What did you think of Germany's response by just sending helmets?
Yeah, well, Germany's in a different position, difficult position in some sense. You've seen that with the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which goes under the Baltic Sea directly from Russia to Germany. That pipeline is built; it's ready to go, effectively. And Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has stopped certification on that, and that won't happen now. So that pipeline effectively is useless. And Germany is very dependent on Russian oil and gas, particularly gas for heating. It's what powers the central heating throughout not just Germany but much of Central Europe. So they're very dependent on Russia, and for that reason they've taken a bit more of a middle ground from particularly the Anglo countries who are not reliant or far less reliant. The UK takes a small share of Russian gas traditionally, but has got the reserves in the North Sea and gets its supplies from elsewhere. When you are dependent on Russia economically, it does put you in a slightly different position. And of course, Germany's that much closer. You've only got Poland in between Germany and Ukraine. So all of these issues are interlinked. I also spent 3 months learning Russian in Belarus back in 2018, and of course you've got these troops coming from Belarus, Belarusian troops allied with Russian troops now that are invading in Ukraine from the north. So It's just so much going on at the moment. It's really hard to take in just how much is happening right now. While Joe Biden was warning us and the US was warning us, US intelligence was warning us that this would happen, I guess we all hoped that that was the worst-case scenario and it wouldn't come to pass, but it really has. Today is the worst-case scenario and really just changes the world today, I think.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's Jeffrey Miller, international analyst at the Democracy Project at Victoria University in Wellington.
Your first edition for everything global and local. It's Early Edition with Kate Hawkesby, Newstalk ZB.
20 past 5, the government's urgently passing a sanctions law that can freeze Russian assets and close our airspace and waters to Russian aircraft and ships. There's also a list of 100 people banned from travelling here, including Vladimir Putin. I don't know how much Vladimir was planning on coming to New Zealand, but also banned as the Russian Prime Minister, the General of the Russian Army. I mean, you get the picture on that list. So is this all a bit too little too late, or is it really just the best we can do? With us now, Jeffrey Miller, an international analyst from the Democracy Project. Thanks for being with us, Jeffrey. Do you think New Zealand acted quick enough to try and get this bill passed? Have we done enough here?
Good morning, Kate. Well, it's certainly been a while in the coming, a while to be introduced. Australia introduced their sanctions against Russia over a week ago now. So, and New Zealand was becoming quite conspicuous by its absence on the list. You had, everyone from Switzerland and Monaco to Singapore and Japan, and all of those countries have traditionally been reluctant to introduce sanctions, but they've all imposed sanctions before New Zealand. So, New Zealand really was under a lot of pressure to join the club.
Are you pleased with the actions taken?
Well, I think it's a bit mixed, really. The government had an autonomous sanctions bill that they could have passed that was on the books there by Jerry Brownlee. That Labor blocked that last year, and because they didn't really want to revive that, and they didn't want to give Brownlee and National the win, I think they came up with this workaround of a special Russian sanctions bill. It also avoids difficult questions relating to China by doing one just specifically for Russia. It avoids setting that precedent and having it genuinely that can be used in all situations. And the government said, that they're going to take advice on introducing a wider autonomous sanctions regime. Well, I think they'll certainly take their time getting that advice because, it's been quite a part of New Zealand's strategy over the last 30 years in its foreign policy to avoid having pressure to put in sanctions against countries, for trade reasons, really.
Yeah. I mean, we've got the list, the super yacht component. I mean, that's all a bit for show, isn't it, the super yacht component?
I would agree. I think a lot of that's a smokescreen to talk about super yachts and in aircraft and so on. I mean, let's face it, at the moment with the border restrictions, no one is getting into New Zealand who's not a New Zealander at the moment anyway. So I think that's largely a smokescreen element. I mean, Ardern has said that, this is much stronger than, the autonomous sanctions bill would have provided. And there is some evidence for that because, according to the press release at least, we'll have to wait to see the text of the bill. It will also give the ability to sanction oligarchs who are of economic or strategic relevance to Russia, even if they're not necessarily directly associated with the invasion, which is significant. But we'll have to wait and see the text of the bill to see exactly what impact it would have. I mean, I would argue, Kate, that, in some ways, this is largely a distraction because, New Zealand doesn't have a lot of relations with Russia. How much of an impact will this have, as you said in your intro? When you've got this travel ban list, I mean, these people weren't coming into New Zealand. There will be perhaps, the odd oligarch who's supporting Putin who will get caught up in this, who's got assets in New Zealand. But I think New Zealand can do a lot more in other ways, humanitarian assistance. Of 1.5 million refugees now coming out of Ukraine. New Zealand isn't taking any extra refugees. If you go back to 2015, John Key took an extra 600 refugees from Syria, for example. We haven't seen any of that from Jacinda Ardern.
No, which is surprising, yeah. I would have thought. Jeffrey, appreciate your time. Thanks very much for being with us. Jeffrey Miller, Democracy Project international analyst. You just got to wonder whether it would have been quicker and easier to, pass through Brownlee's bill. Bit of a bad look, though, I guess, for Labor.
Bailey's Real Estate. This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Neva Reddy Manu. The Foreign Affairs Minister has outlined just how far beyond Russia proposed new sanctions could go. A bespoke Russian sanctions bill, drafted specifically for conflict in Ukraine, will be passed under urgency this week. It'll enable sanctions on people, companies and assets related to the invasion or who are of economic or strategic relevance to Russia. The bill also allows for sanctions to be imposed against other states complicit with Russia's actions, such as Belarus. Foreign Affairs Minister Nanaia Mahuta says the framework is broad.
Through the regulation-making process, there will be thresholds within that to consider as to how far a sanction would apply.
But there's criticism our sanctions aren't as strong as those of some other countries. Democracy Project international analyst Geoffrey Miller told Kate Hawkesby they've taken a while to be introduced.
You had everyone from Switzerland and Monaco to Singapore and Japan, and all of those countries have traditionally been reluctant to introduce sanctions, but they've all imposed sanctions before New Zealand.
It's Newstalk ZB News with the Hitachi heat pumps.